I'm sorry, I'm going to start all over again. For posterity. Okay, so take two. Okay, ready? Welcome all. We are in for a real treat tonight. Prepare to be entertained and enlightened. Since Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals became a household phrase in the 2008 election, I have been eagerly anticipating this evening. Our speaker, Michael Walsh, has gone undercover as David Kahane, the leftist. He has blown his cover to come to speak to us tonight, a rare and extremely valuable opportunity. Michael Walsh has a well-rounded and very diverse career. For 16 years, he was the classical music critic for Time magazine. He is a best-selling author of fiction and nonfiction, a screenwriter, and a conservative media critic. Michael was a visiting fellow of the University Professors, Professor of Journalism, and Professor of Film and Television at Boston University. He is currently Vice President of the Board of the Wanda Museum, devoted to East German and Soviet art, artifacts, and scholarship in Culver City, California. In January 2010, in collaboration with Andrew Breitbart, he launched BigJournalism.com. Michael has written for the Washington Post and for National Review using the fictional persona of David Kahane. Brad Thor, in his review of Rules for Radical Conservatives on Amazon, stated, "Make no mistake, Kahane is no leftist plant. He's the real deal, and he's here to help save America. Never has there been a funnier book that so succinctly spells out the left's game and how to beat them at it. Only when you stop laughing will you realize how much you have learned and how much better prepared you are to take the fight to those who would destroy America and everything we hold dear." Now, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Michael Walsh, a.k.a. David Kahane.
Thank you, Doris. Thank you, Skirball Center. Thank you, Children of the Jewish Holocaust Survivors and the other groups who have been so kind and to honor me with an invitation to speak to you today. I'm very, very grateful to you all. I think I should start by explaining the joke. I know usually in comedy you don't do that till the end, but and that's only if the audience doesn't get the joke in the first place. But last month, my wife and I were on the National Review cruise to the Caribbean, and of course I was advertised as being David Kahane. And then I realized that everybody was sitting there saying, "Who's this Michael Walsh guy?" Because they hadn't read many of the columns, which tend to appear in the online version of National Review and not in the actual print version of National Review. The online, in case you don't go there on a regular basis, let me encourage you to do so. It's probably 10 times the size of the magazine on any given day. It has an enormous amount of editorial content. The famous blog called The Corner, which is part of the site, has comments from all of the NRO contributors on the day's events, and I'm sure had I been able to get to it this afternoon, the comments about Judge Hudson's decision regarding Obamacare would have been very, very interesting to read. David Kahane was born about 3 years ago when I was here in LA and looking for an outlet to sort of express a lot of things that I wanted to talk about, and also to do something that I thought was very important, and it will come up later on this evening, which is to explain Hollywood to the right. There's a lot of suspicion about what we do here in Hollywood on the right. And so I was talking to Catherine Lopez, who's the editor of National Review Online, and we decided we'd come up with a character who would be a sort of 30-something lefty, red diaper baby, true-believing Alinskyite Hollywood screenwriter. In other words, just like every other screenwriter in Hollywood. And then, so as we finally came up with the character, she said, "What do you want to call him?" And I said, "Let me think for a minute." And then I thought of the movie The Player. All those of you who've seen The Player by Robert Altman, you'll know that the screenwriter character in that, who's played by Vincent D'Onofrio, is named David Kahane. And David Kahane, the screenwriter in The Player, meets a kind of typical fate here in Hollywood. He's beaten to death by a studio executive and then drowned in a puddle of water. So we know that the execs really want to do that to us. So I adopted the name from that movie as kind of the patron saint of screenwriters all over town. So that's who David Kahane is, and I've also asked whether I'm actually just using a nom de plume. The answer is no. David Kahane is a character, just like any character I would invent for a novel or a script. He's got his own life. He has a lovely palatial mansion in Echo Park. See, now I know I'm talking to an LA audience because you get that joke. His father is Che Kahane. He's always referred to as the sainted Che Kahane. Dave's mother is what's her name, because he doesn't really know his mom. And of course, there's Uncle Joe, who is Che's brother. And they all, the two elder Kahanes live in Hallandale, Florida, which some of you may know is known as Lansky Land, which is where Meyer Lansky spent many happy years, in part as one of the great gangsters in American history. And since my view of the Democrat Party is that it's effectively a criminal organization masquerading as a political party, it just seemed that Lansky Land was an appropriate place to put the Kahane family. So that's who Dave is. Dave dates all the cool Hollywood starlets. He and Lindsay Lohan are like this. He drives a Prius, naturally, with a license plate that says my other car is a Jaguar, which he's lying about, of course. And as I say, he has a palatial pad in Echo Park, and the one little running joke with David Kahane is that all of his movies that he tells you that he's writing are sequels. And it's always something like The Godfather 4, this time it's personal. All of his subtitles are, this time it's personal. Well, so the idea behind the book was after Dave wrote a couple of columns. I should tell you about these. Some of you, I'm sure, have read them. One of them was called I Hate You, Sarah Palin. Needless to say, this went viral on the internet. And I got the idea for that as I was driving down Sunset Boulevard, and was a movie out called I Hate You, Sarah Marshall, Forgetting Sarah Marshall. And you saw billboards all over town that said, I hate you, Sarah Marshall. And Sarah Palin had just been nominated by at the convention. So I wrote this column about how much I loathe Sarah. This is one of the first hate on Sarah Palin columns. And it just set off a blizzard of activity, including from a lot of people on the right who didn't get the joke. So I got some letters from them, too. And from the left, naturally. So that kind of established the Kahane persona in the magazine. And then after she stepped down from the governorship of Alaska, Dave couldn't resist that golden hanging ripe fruit whack, and he wrote, I still hate you, Sarah Palin. Which was read aloud on the Rush Limbaugh show by guest host Mark Belling. And it's very odd to be sitting there watching your email box suddenly jump from 0 to 1 million. And you go, I better turn the radio on. And I did, and then suddenly I heard the mellifluous, indeed brilliant tones of the music of David Kahane coming back at me, and I said, gee, I know that guy somewhere along the line. So that was how Dave was born, and then from that this book has resulted, and thank you so much for coming tonight to hear me read a bit from the book and to discuss any of the ideas in there that's in it with you. The introduction of the book is written by Che, and so when I wrote it, I put on the Rolling Stones' Sympathy for the Devil and played it about 50 million times to get me a kind of temp track to get into the thing. But after Che speaks, then Dave himself speaks. And the reason this book exists is for the following, the reasons. Dave, as a lefty, is sick and tired of you pusillanimous, mewing, right-wing cowards. He thinks you can't fight. And having been schooled by the great Alinsky, who he often refers to as the Apostle Saul, he thinks it's time for the right to learn to fight like the left. So he's doing this. He's been sent by Che to bring the word to you. And he wants you to learn from the master himself. So the entire book is to teach the right what the left is about and how to fight it. And I hope that it's funny, but it's also serious. And since I'm a good deal older than Dave, I remember the 60s very vividly. I remember what the country went through starting from, say, 65, 66 on. Certainly the years I was in college from 67 to 71 were some of the worst years in American history, including the really dreadful year of 1968, for those of you who remember back that far. And I think that a lot of the things I observed and have observed over the years, and both as a conservative working in Hollywood and as just someone who's interested and who loves our country, as you all do, that I wanted to put these ideas in this book in kind of one handy place, and also for my children to tell them this is how it was in the 60s. And even as, no matter how crazy it actually is in the book, it was even crazier in person. So here's Dave now talking to you. I want you to understand that very little of what you are about to read has happened by accident, that most of it was done with malice aforethought. Not in any vast left-wing conspiracy sort of way, controlled from Moscow center by a giggling psychopath stroking a white cat, but still deliberately, and with the clear intention of bringing down your society and replacing it with something else. Something that will still be called the United States of America. Maybe, we haven't decided yet. But will bear as little resemblance to the land of Lincoln as 19th century Britain does to its 21st century incarnation. I want you to understand that with each passing day, as we wrap our tentacles more tightly around you, binding you with a million small pieces of petty legislation, harassing legal tactics, intrusive law enforcement, and the criminalization of just about everything, we are doing this for a reason, to weaken you enough so that in the unlikely event you actually do decide to fight back, you won't be able to. I want you to understand that when we say it's for your own good, we mean it's for our own good. When we use a term like social justice, what we really mean is that payback's a bitch. When we speak of affordable housing, what we really mean is that we want to destroy your communities by attacking your property values. When we start complaining that something is unsustainable, we haven't the slightest shred of evidence to support that assertion, and what we really mean is that it is in fact entirely sustainable, but that we're doing our best to wreck it. When we start babbling on about advocacy and activism, only we men of the left could invent out of whole cloth the twin non-professions of activist and advocate and have them taken seriously in the pages of the New York Times. What we're really talking about are what used to be known as agitators. Whenever we accuse you of something nefarious, and our usual litany, which you all know, includes such well-worn staples as racism, sexism, ageism, heightism, weightism, carnivorism, anti-disestablishmentarianism, homophobia, tribecaphobia, hydrophobia, and glossolalia, or of adopting a particularly mean, dirty, and low-down tactic, all that means is that those are the things we are thinking of at this exact moment and would actually indulge in ourselves if we thought you weren't looking. When we say hate speech, we mean pretty much every word that comes out of your mouths. When we speak of such things as fierce moral urgency, our morality is based on absolutely nothing more than whatever suits our purposes, and bears only an accidental resemblance to anything found in such traditional sources of morality as churches and synagogues, or basic common decency. We really do believe that as far as you're concerned, the perfect must always be the enemy of the good, and that the impossibly perfect must always and everywhere be the enemy of the good enough right now. Therefore, nothing you can ever do will please us, and we will always hold it against you. I want you to understand the truth of Frost's observation that a liberal is a man too broad-minded to take his own side in an argument. I want you to understand the truth of Chesterton's observation that tolerance is the only virtue left to the man who no longer believes in anything. I want you to understand that although we may profess to celebrate life, in fact we are little more than a suicide cult, intent on doing in our rage and self-loathing as much damage as possible before finally shuffling off into the darkness that we're sure awaits us. I want you to understand that we will not be happy until you agree with us, one way or the other. I want you to understand that you have met the enemy, and he is us. So this is Dave's introduction to this tour d'horizon that he's going to give you in the first half of the book, which is called The Problem. about the last 40 years or so, 50 years or so of American history. And it takes us through a kind of brisk tour, and written in Dave's sort of inimitable comic style. And I wanted to sort of read a few of the high points, I think, from this analysis. But one thing I think I need to put on the table right now is, it's been my theory for quite a while that we're in the middle of a cold civil war, as I've called it. That is to say, the battle between the baby boomers of my generation has been raging since the Vietnam War, and will continue to rage until our kids are bankrupted by paying our Social Security. The split, I think, is pretty much 50-50. It might actually be 60-40, but in terms of what's known as the educated class, or the credentialed class, rather, it's probably 50-50, and that fight has been going on for a very long time. And I think those of you who are my age know that. 1968, remember, began with so many terrible things, the first of which was President Johnson basically announcing at the end of a very long speech about oil, we tend to forget, that he would not be running for president. Martin Luther King was assassinated. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. The cities erupted in riots. There was a riot at the Chicago Convention, and we're only up to June and July here. So when we think we live through troubled times right now, I say go back and think about 1968, if you want to remember how things really were. But this settled down after the riots, both the student riots, which I think effectively ended with Kent State, and the inner-city riots. And it settled down into something that I've called the Cold Civil War. And that Cold Civil War rages quietly, but very, very intensely today. And I think we've all seen that in our own lives. For years, I must say that as a fairly out conservative, we have lots of liberal friends. Since the election of President Obama, we've lost every single one of them. I cannot really account for this, but they no longer call us. We're no longer invited to dinner parties. It's as if all through the Bush years, we could be friends, but now we no longer can be friends. I find that sorrowing and disturbing at the same time. Again, it's part of this idea that I think is going on of this Cold Civil War, and these are all people our age. One of the big differences between the left and the right, I think, is that the left has become fundamentally an atheistic force, and people of faith on the right, whether Jewish or Christian, obviously are not. And I think that's key to understanding much of the rage of the left. I think I've often referred to it as a suicide cult, and David Kahane calls it a suicide cult all the time. It occurred to me that one of the people most responsible for this is Madalyn Murray O'Hair. I don't know how many of you remember Madalyn Murray, but whatever we may think of the school prayer decision, something fundamentally changed about America in the wake of that. But I wanted to just let you have a few of Dave's words of wisdom about faith. By accepting the validity of our premise that you must practice what you preach, we have won the argument before it has even begun. You can kill them with this, writes Saul Alinsky, for they can no more obey their own rules than the Christian church can live up to Christianity. That's a very important point that Alinsky makes, that in order to destroy the opposition, you take them at their word and insist they live up to everything. There's no room for failure, there's no room for hypocrisy, even socially useful hypocrisy, that the slightest deviation from what is deemed by the other side to be your orthodoxy invalidates the whole truth of what you profess to believe. Have you cheated on your wife? Have you drunk to excess? Cheated on your taxes? Spoken out in favor of morality, yet secretly viewed pornography? Then you, sir or madam, are a hypocrite, and nothing you say will henceforth be seriously entertained. By your own actions you have invalidated your own argument, because you have made the fatal error of professing to stand for a set of abstract moral principles, whereas we stand for nothing at all. You, sir, can say a lot about the left. Oh, that we're godless, malevolent, scheming, ambitious, amoral power seekers who bend to break any rule in order to get what we want. And not only would you be right, but we'd accept those terms as the compliments they so obviously are. There is no law, even one we passed ourselves, that we will not seek to ignore, change, or subvert if it serves our larger goal. Heck, just ask the good Democratic Solons of Massachusetts, who, faced with the possibility that John F. Kerry might win the presidency in 2004 and therefore be replaced in the Senate by a Republican, changed the law to take such an appointment out of the hands of the governor, then a Republican, and instead replaced the missing senator a few months later in a special election with the seat vacant in the meantime. 5 years later, after the death of the Lion of Chappaquiddick and desperately needing another secure vote to pass the health care plan, they simply repealed that law and allowed the governor to immediately appoint a hack to the seat until the duly ordained elections rolled around. Similarly, when the stench of corruption surrounding the then incumbent, now former New Jersey Senator Robert Torricelli became too ripe even for New Jersey to bear, the organized crime entity known as the New Jersey Democratic Party just replaced him as their candidate with the husk of a superannuated prior senator shortly before the election, in clear violation of the plain language of the New Jersey Constitution and election laws. So, you want to make something of it? We don't play by those rules, and it's one of the reasons that we continue to lose. Now, of course, the last election was quite a wake-up call, but I was speaking to the Tea Party of Southern Illinois just before the election outside of St. Louis. And then afterwards, I realized that what we saw in November was a kind of Midwestern revolt against the coasts. And it rolled all the way to your doorstep in California and all the way to my doorstep in Connecticut and stopped right there, didn't it? We went over the state, both in California and in Connecticut. The biggest danger that I believe as a writer and as a speaker that we face in this country is something called political correctness. It's bothered me for a very long time, and its hold on our society continues to amaze me because it seems to be so anti-intellectual and in fact so immoral. So Dave has a couple of choice words about that. For us to be able to control you sheep, the last thing we can permit is your ability to think for yourself. If Walter Lippmann thought that public opinion ought to be organized for the press rather than by the press, and he did in a famous essay, he was only dimly glimpsing the way forward, for he understood that some opinions should simply not be allowed to exist. There is no such thing as free speech. That was always a founding father chimera, an Enlightenment fantasy, a brief moment in time when the options kept Fortress America safe from the taste of our conformist lash. And it's high time you understand that. There is only acceptable speech and unacceptable speech, and as you can imagine, the latter as well, unacceptable. Political correctness is, to put it bluntly, fascism of the mind. Our way of ostensibly protecting you from your own worst instincts, but really protecting ourselves from the consequences of your inadvertently articulating the truth. Of all the master's inventions, the master is always Satan, it is among the most brilliant. By imposing the scourge of political correctness upon your discourse, we have robbed you of the ability to speak and thus to think freely. You must now weigh every word you say against an imaginary standard of offense that constantly shifts. No matter how stupid or uneducated the individual, you must watch what you say, even to consigning unto purdah perfectly good English words that somehow might be misinterpreted by an idiot. In the guise of compassion, one of our favorite words, we have essentially deprived you of your own language and replaced it with one more to our liking. One, in other words, in which you can't criticize us. For as John Milton noted in the Areopagitica, freedom of speech goes hand in hand with freedom of thought, and indeed with all other freedoms. When you cannot call your tongue your own, then truly you possess nothing. Political correctness didn't just simply happen. It was not born out of some popular mandate or out of the collective unconscious striving to rectify a past wrong. We made it happen. It came to you in the guise of a good thing. Who could object to inoffensiveness, to an unhostile workplace, a non-threatening atmosphere, a non-hurtful culture? Everything we do always seems so reasonable, doesn't it? And you bought it. It never occurred to you, so browbeaten had you become, that there is plenty to object to about inoffensiveness. Vigorous, bold, and yes, offensive speech has been a hallmark of the American discourse since the frontier days. It used to be a staple of your political discourse as well. Did you ever see how they talked about Abraham Lincoln in the 19th century? You used to be a man and woman enough to take it and like it and give it back tenfold. That used to be a point of pride with you. And yet, we have convinced you that our way, the way of the weasel, the whiner, the tort lawyer, no offense to any tort lawyers in the audience, of course, the talking head, the way of Ellsworth Toohey and the fountainhead, greatest villain in modern literature, should be your way as well. Now self-censorship has tiptoed into your life, a vice cloaked as a virtue, just the way the master drew it up on the blackboard in hell so long ago. If you don't mind me injecting a little anachronism in my pursuit of a cheap sports metaphor, for soon enough sports metaphors will be just about the only ones you'll be able to understand. That's what I think about political correctness. I think it really robs us of our ability to argue and thrash out the issues of the day. Recently, just 2 weeks ago, I was asked by the New York Post to become an op-ed columnist, so my columns will now run on Fridays, I think, in the New York Post. But my very first one was sort of in praise of partisanship. Not bipartisanship, but in praise of partisanship, that what politics is about, what democracy is about, is arguing and is testing, as Milton says in the Areopagitica, putting the truth to the test. Milton says, I cannot praise a cloistered and fugitive virtue who never sallies forth upon the field of battle, which means you can't just hold an opinion and never have it tested, because if you lose, you will then become offended. You have to take your opinion out into the marketplace and test it, and that's what our political system is about, and one of the reasons I really, truly despise political correctness as much as I do. The second half of the book is devoted to the rules for radical conservatives. And they're divided into 10 rules with a number of corollaries, and I just wanted to give you a little taste of one of them. One of the models for this book is obviously C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters, if you know that book. And that's a book written by a devil, Screwtape, who's writing a series of letters to his nephew, Wormwood, who is trying to seduce the man they call the patient to bring him over to the dark side. And Wormwood's having a considerable amount of trouble with this man and his faith, and Screwtape is constantly on his case and explaining to him how to seduce him and fool him, and so we can drag him off at the end. That was a powerful influence on me when I wrote this book. Also, Milton's Paradise Lost, which really is a great poem, even though who was it that said that no one ever wished it longer? But I do like that very much. One really important thing about the left that I found growing up with them and watching them all these years is that they are absolutely ruthless, and I admire that ruthlessness about them. They don't quit. And so rule number 2 is become what you behold, which means to be more like them than be like us. And Dave has this to say about corollary number 3, give no quarter. I'm talking political now, not violence. Fight like we do to the end, because by now it should be apparent we will never leave you alone. And here's why. You're our meal tickets. Those we might term the party of take are sitting pretty, with the genius that has characterized our side since they battled their fellow boomers for the choicest seats in kindergarten. My father's Che's generation now sits comfortably in their academic or governmental sinecures, their workload light, their pensions secured, which gives them plenty of time to think up more mischief at your expense. Meanwhile, the party of give, the boomers approaching retirement in the private sector, are staring into the abyss of a pretty bleak future. Their homes are worth half of what they thought they were. Well, in LA, they're worth a tenth of what they thought they were. They've been beggared by the high cost of prep schools and private colleges when they could afford them at all, and now they find themselves being ruthlessly downsized by colleagues young enough to be their kids, without enough money in the bank and staring at Social Security as their flawed savior. Because they had to work and pay taxes and raise families larger than 1.0 kids, they never had enough time or energy to get involved in politics. Not to the extent that we of the party of take did. And so gradually, incrementally, they have been bled white as they watch the employment scales tip from private industry to government jobs, helpless victims of the great blood-sucking beast we like to call public service. For some of you, it may be too late, but there's no reason the rest of you can't start fighting back before we take everything you have and then some. Luckily for us, and those racist gun-toting teabaggers notwithstanding, you remain politically fairly pathetic. After Sarah Palin rocked us back on our heels during the election of 2008, we regrouped quickly and soon began to carve her up, reducing the woman, who, were she a progressive, would have been a heroine and a role model, into a caricature of a dodo bird, too stupid to name a single newspaper or magazine when confronted by Katie Couric's stiletto. It wouldn't be an LA appearance if we didn't talk about Hollywood a little bit. And this is another subject. Since Dave began, really as a way to explain Hollywood to the right, which thinks of Hollywood as a sort of vast conspiracy of leftists who are trying to tear down America, and, you know, most of the time that may have some truth to it, but a lot of time it doesn't. A lot of time it just has to do with the fact that your kids aren't working in Hollywood. That's all there is to it. They're not writing books. They're not writing movies. They're not teaching in academia. We have abdicated a great swath of the culture and left it open so that there is very little balance. I spent 5 years teaching at Boston University, which is a wonderful university. It is actually relatively less ideological than some Columbia universities I could name. But the mindset is all of a piece, in a sense, when you get into the faculty lounge. And how well the faculty lounge philosophy works when applied to actual governance, we're witnessing right this minute. But we have to put our stamp back in these professions. We can't just stand outside and snipe at them. We have to engage them. And this is really a very important point, and Dave brings himself up here to corollary number 2. Stop thinking that Hollywood is a dirty word. Here's what you need to know. Hollywood runs on fear and greed. And as soon as the money lies on the opposite side of the left-right equation, fear and greed will switch teams. For a long time, its unassailable position as the driver of popular culture left it immune to the vagaries of the marketplace. As long as the big tentpole movies made money, it could afford to indulge its leftist political leanings with films designed not to succeed at the box office, but to succeed at Beverly Hills dinner parties. Hence the spate of Iraq War duds like Rendition, Redaction, Return to Bethlehem. Okay, I made that last one up, sort of. All made with malice aforethought, and with the full knowledge that they wouldn't recoup a penny. Not that any Hollywood film has ever recouped, just ask any writer with monkey points. We just saw one of those the other day. It's called Fair Game. I'm sure you all ran right out and saw that one. It did $7 million with Sean Penn. It cost at least 40 to make. And that movie was so bad that the Washington Post ran an editorial against it. Whoa, let's just think about that for a minute, shall we? But when you stop to think about it in the larger culture, the real culture, as opposed to the imaginary culture that's served up in the cinema, seen on television, and delivered to your progressively autocratic breakfast table each morning by the likes of Frank Rich, it's okay to boo, Paul Krugman, and Tom, I, me, mine, and did I mention myself, Friedman of the New York Times, we've created a bizarro universe in which we force you to live through the simple expedient of your having taken yourselves out of the game. We have to get back in the game. That is really an important point. I'm giving up one of my beautiful daughters to the acting profession, so I encourage you all to do the same thing. But if we don't, and corollary number 3 is reclaim academia. If we don't do that, then we really have no right to complain. If Hollywood can afford to make movies that nobody goes to see, except our friends, then that's its business. It's not a public business, it's a private business. But we can't complain about it. All I say in meetings when this comes up, and believe me, I usually keep my mouth shut, is this. People don't want conservative movies. Conservative movies die at the box office. Any ideologically driven movie is not going to get beyond its very narrow base. I think I speak for hopefully most of us, if not all of us in this room, to say that all we want to see from a movie is not be insulted by it. That's all. We want a good story, but we don't want an insult, a drive-by shooting, a glancing blow that insults some core principle of what is still the majority in this country. And I think that's the key to bring Hollywood back into more of an even keel, is to have movies that are neutral. People say to me, what's the greatest conservative movie ever made? And I said, that's easy. High Noon. That was written by a card-carrying communist who was blacklisted. And that is the greatest conservative movie there is. So that's the point. Tell a good story. And then the audience will come. Finally, I have rule number 9. Rule number 9 is never stop fighting till the fight is over. That's something that the Kevin Costner character says to the Robert De Niro character in The Untouchables. After De Niro's convicted, the Capone character is convicted. Never stop fighting till the fight is done, says Kevin. And that is really the most important takeaway point for us, I think, tonight. At times we appear to have won the argument. 1980, Jimmy Carter was sent packing. 1984, Walter Mondale won one state. And we think, okay, well, now the country's finally over this, and now we're going to get back to kind of a normal. No. They never stop. So we can never stop. And that's a good thing. That is a good thing. You don't want this to end. You want this argument to go on until the last days. Because that is how we move the country forward. That is the real progress, the testing of antithetical ideas. So Dave has a little thought about this, which is, you have an honorable history. Use it. What have you got to be ashamed of? Starting with Lincoln, who took over a nascent political party founded in Wisconsin, for crying out loud. You ended slavery and preserved the Union against what became the Democratic Solid South. It was the Republicans who partnered with LBJ to put our Civil Rights Act of 1964 against a Democrat-led filibuster in the Senate. And who led that filibuster? Albert Arnold Gore Sr. Robert K.K.K. Byrd, and Sleepin' Sam Ervin, the hero of Watergate. Those three men filibustered the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It was Republicans who steered the country into the Gilded Age, and despite the constant efforts to undermine it, created the greatest engine of prosperity and growth the world had ever seen. It was the Republicans under Ronald Reagan who took down an enemy every bit, of course Dave calls the Soviets enemies in quotes, every bit as dangerous as those we fought in World War II. And I say that with no little pride and a lot of regret. That's a pretty impressive history you guys got there, so embrace it, and most important, use it against us. Show us up for the cowards and the bullies, the clowards and the pivans we really are, the kind of people who start fights but never finish them, who hide behind our lawyers' skirts when the going gets tough, who never met a manly institution we didn't want to tear down. The mommy party. As Camille Paglia famously said in the introduction to her masterpiece, Sexual Personae, if civilization had been left in female hands, we would all still be living in grass huts. But we see that as a plus, not a minus. We've turned the environmental movement, really just a bunch of old-line commies who couldn't figure out what to do with themselves after the fall of the Soviet Union, into our storm soldiers, torching suburban developments and car lots with relative impunity. We have our serious thinkers, you know, the Harvard boys who read for the New Yorker, arguing for sustainable growth, which means no growth at all, for denser cities, for the elimination of the automobile. We are on a crusade with our Islamic comrades in arms to return the world to a prelapsarian state before the Industrial Revolution, and if possible, all the way back to the fall of Rome, if not the Garden of Eden. Show us for the haters we really are, people who hate the United States even as we bristle when you challenge our patriotism, people who hate Western civilization. Hey, hey, ho, ho, Western civ has got to go. Y'all remember that? I think that was at Stanford. People who hate organized religion. The Saint of Alinsky told us to attack Christianity, and have we ever? For its prescriptions and its contributions to the rise of the West. Strip away our masks and reveal the skulls beneath our skins. Not the skulls of ordinary human beings, but the titanium skull of the Terminator. As entertaining as it can be, rage is all we have left instead of a coherent philosophy. So sally forth and engage us, the enemy. And corollary number 2, go radical conservative. And what I mean by radical conservative is very simple. It's constitutional conservatism. Mark Levin and I have become very good friends, and I must say that Mark was tremendously helpful to me. I had a heart attack while I was writing this book and writing a thriller at the same time. And a man I'd never met reached out to me. You all know Mark from his radio show. Because he had also gone through some heart problems and was incredibly supportive. And the night this book came out, Mark had me on the show for a half an hour talking about these principles. And of course, I'm a great admirer of liberty and tyranny as well. Constitutional conservatism is what we're really all about. The framework that is provided for us with a minimum amount of fuss, with a minimum amount of rules, is the best way to organize a civilized country. I was just listening to Dr. Larry Arnn, who's the head of Hillsdale College. I had a pleasure of meeting him when I was up in Michigan a couple months ago, talking about that these rules, laws used to be simple, and we created a country out of them. Now, the health care bill is 1,000+ pages of basically fine print and red tape. We've got to get back to principles, and that's what I will leave you with before we take questions now. People say, well, what is your prescription? And I say it's very simple. Principles, not programs. Principles, not programs. Every time we start getting into programs, we're going to lose, because it means we've accepted the premise of the left that we need more programs. What we need is strong principles and hold to them. So I encourage the Republicans, of whom I'm not one, and the conservatives, of whom I'm very much one, to always stick to principles. When you do that, you can't go wrong. And it allows you to cut through the fog, and some of the issues that I've raised here today that David Kahane raises in the book. Principles allow us to stand on our own feet, cast off political correctness, cast off this sort of 40 years of accretion that has landed on our heads to the point where literally almost everything is now a crime or will be a crime. Food, trans fat, smoking, whatever. We've given up an enormous amount of liberty, and you could argue that the liberty needed to be given up for the greater good of all the people. But that's not a fundamentally American idea. The fundamentally American idea is the greatest good for the greatest number of people is to be found in the individual, not in the collective. So this is what Rules for Radical Conservatives is about. It's a dash of cold water in your face. I hope it's funny and it's amusing. It's historically as correct as I could make it. And I wrote it to become public enemy number 1, and now I'm pleased to say that I actually am public enemy number 1. So thank you so much for coming, and let's take some questions.
All the Zelensky stuff seems very, very Orwellian, so I was wondering if there was a connection.
I'm sorry, I'm also getting, in addition to senile deaf, so can you just repeat that question?
Sure, absolutely. I have never read Zelensky, but I've read a lot of Orwell.
Yes.
And all the Zelensky stuff seems very Orwellian, and I was wondering if it was based on that.
What's interesting is when writers of the left come over, one of the first things they say is, we always knew it was a lie. And we had to live this lie for so long that we had to stop finally living the lie. Orwell, was obviously socially committed young writer. Eric Bloor was his name. But by the time he saw what I would argue is sort of the inevitable consequences of Soviet communism, when he could see that coming, he could no longer tolerate that. Now, I spent, as it turned out, from 1985 to 1991, I spent much of my career behind the Iron Curtain, and Doris mentioned that I'm on the board of the Venda Museum here in Los Angeles, which is devoted to scholarship of those countries and of that period, and I'm pleased to see our director is here tonight too. So please go see the Venda Museum. There, I've got the plug in for the Venda Museum, Justin. But it's a fabulous place. I want you to go there, and I want you to just smell it. I want you to look at it, and I want you to understand that this is how these people lived. And they lived not because it started off as this malevolent conspiracy, but because that's where it goes if you follow it all the way down to the end of the line. And finally, I was there in November of 1989 with a sledgehammer in my hand when the Berlin Wall came down, and I must say it was one of the most enjoyable experiences of my entire life. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. Where is this museum? I live in Culver City.
Justin, you want to stand up and tell us? Or shall I tell us?
You know.
It's on, well, I do. I was just there the other day. It's on Buckingham Parkway, is that correct? Right off of Slauson, near La Cienega. So we're back up in sort of little business park, but with any luck. Wende is a German word for turning point or change. It's spelled W-E-N-D-E. So think Wendy's, but don't go there because they probably have trans fat. And go to the Wende Museum instead. You'll find it an incredibly moving experience.
Okay. I read Solomonsky's book when Obama was running for president.
Yes.
And I thought Republicans could learn a lot from it.
Yes.
I was very impressed with what he said. There was an article in National Review magazine a few months ago about Zelensky's book. Did you see it?
Yes.
And it was a rather positive take on it. Did you comment on that?
Well, yeah. I mean, my whole book is kind of a tribute to the Saul Alinsky book because Alinsky was essentially a nihilist who understood that by using that famous rule number 4, turn your enemy's weapons against him, you could bring down almost any institution. It is almost inconceivable for me, thinking back to being a kid in the 1950s or a teenager in the 1960s, to think how many institutions that looked unassailable have not only been assailed but demolished. Partly because, as I like to say to my friends on the left, there's no idea too ridiculous for you to actually believe. Now, I mean that in the nicest possible way. But Alinsky was determined to, whether you take him at face value and think he was trying to right some social wrong, or whether you think he's just a kind of malevolent spirit, is really up to you to decide. The book's not very well written, and it's kind of tedious, but it's short, so there's one good thing about it.
Hi, I was wondering who in the current crop of politicians in Washington, conservatives on our side, sort of get this and can understand what we need to do and how we need to change the dialogue and change our tactics to win?
Yeah, I did a little reading from this book at a private meeting in New York to several sitting senators and congressmen, and was asked to kind of explain the rules to them to their face, which was kind of fun. Some of the guys I wish were there weren't there. It's hard to say. I mean, I always say that when you get into presidential politics, it's way too early to start handicapping, because none of us knew who Barack Obama was 2 years before 2006, say, right? Really, he'd spoken at the convention, but we didn't really get a good sense of who he was. We may still not have a very good sense of who he is, but that's a whole other story. I like to say that the Republican Party, which is otherwise known as the stupid party, nominates the woman they've been married to for the last 55 years for president. The Democrats nominate the chick they picked up in the bar last night, whose name they can't remember. I think you're going to see, on our side this time, I think you'll see a Midwestern congressman. I think Paul Ryan or Mike Pence might very well be the guys. Eric Cantor is also, another rapidly rising young congressperson, and I think that's where you're going to see them come from. So it'll be exciting. If it's John McCain again, I'm going to shoot myself.
Very short question.
Sure.
Why do you think why is the far left so hostile to Israel? Because it would seem like it's ironic, because the ones that the Islamic fascists would murder first, they don't like all these leftist values.
Yeah.
But the left seems to love these terrorists and hate Israel. That is the only democracy in the Middle East. So what's going on with that?
I really think this is not a flip answer. I think they're a suicide cult. I think that's the answer. I think they're filled with a kind of rage and self-loathing. And it doesn't matter how many times you say, and the first people they're going to kill is you, that's almost worth it to them as long as they kill us too. I can't, we don't subscribe to that philosophy, so I can't really defend it, but I think that's the answer to it.
That goes along with the atheism, which is at the root
What's that? I'm sorry.
Atheism is at the root, is at the heart of the far left, which is that like meaninglessness.
Yeah, well, without getting, too theological here, although I was an altar boy for a long time, therefore know absolutely nothing about theology, but without getting into that, I do think that that's something to it, which is why I spend a lot of time on Mrs. O'Hare, because I think that the removal of faith, whatever your faith is, the removal of that causes other kinds of behavioral problems that maybe we really haven't quite understood the depths of it, because we've never lived in a largely atheist or certainly secular culture before, and now we are, and now we have to sort out whether that's a good thing. What I mean is that, especially on the national level, on the debate level, our candidates should be sticking to these core constitutional principles, and not, for example, with, say, these budget cuts that are going to be coming up. The Democrats always try to draw the Republican into the weeds by saying, well, which specific programs would you cut? What and then what if you did that? And then how many people are going to be out of work? And then what about this? What about the guy that lost? It just never ends. What they ought to be saying is, let's look at the programs. I'm happy to cut the Department of Homeland Security, which is absolutely, by the way, useless. I'm happy to cut the Department of Energy, the Department of Education. I'd disband the CIA in a heartbeat, since they're, as we call them in the intelligence business, the world's largest self-licking ice cream cone. We could play that game, but I think better at this point to stick to these constitutional principles. I got a good one. Congress shall make no law. How about that one? What part of no don't you understand? Actually, come to think of it, I think Congress making no law is a really good idea for like maybe the next 50,000 years. I think that the Constitution means what it says. I think the amendments have modified the defects in the original Constitution, because almost immediately you get, well, what about the 3/5 compromise? So, do you think black people are 3/5 of a white person? What about that? You racist. Boom, You immediately go from zero to Adolf Hitler, in 10 seconds. And we get rocked back on our heels on this all the time. And we just have to say, no, stop it. The Constitution, the amendments, the 18th Amendment, the 24th Amendment, all the way up to the end, and this is a framework for liberty. This is where I totally agree with my brother Mark Levin. It's a framework for liberty. And then you let the people sort it out, on the state level and on the local level. We are not a top-down government, and we weren't meant to be. And we don't want to be. Yes, sir.
I had a question for you about how to turn around politics in California, but since you're from Connecticut.
No, I actually grew up here in California, so.
Oh, well.
Yes, I'm a sympathetic.
In that case,
yes.
Any idea?
Let's select Arnold Schwarzenegger governor, because he'll be tough with those state employee unions, won't he? Now, that's really too bad. I actually think, and I know we're all kind of sad about the election here, but I think that Jerry Brown's election was actually a good thing. Boo, yeah, but wait, let me explain. I think had Meg tried to do some of the things that he will be forced to do, she would have been a political football with the Democrat-controlled legislature in Sacramento. Either Jerry will do the right thing and be forced to make the cuts, just like Nixon had to go to China. It's going to be a Democrat who's going to have to make the tough choices here in California, or he won't, and the state's going to collapse. It's going to go into bankruptcy, and then things will have to get sorted out all over again. But I think you're almost better off having him as the governor than Meg would have been, because I think she would have made a lot of wrong choices, especially as a rookie. And one thing, Jerry Brown was governor last time I lived in California. So, and when I grew up, his father was the governor. So it's like this Irish mafia that controls California is really amazing. Yes, sir.
This question is for David.
Okay.
I was curious if David Kahane suffered any threats, repercussions, or any other problems for outing their name.
You mean here in Hollyweird?
Yeah.
No. Well, what's funny about this? It was, like I say, this character started as a joke, and it really wasn't I'm trying to protect myself from this. And we were content to sort of let him play out. And once the book got published, then obviously I was going to have to come out and sort of do this. I I personally have argued for a long time that there is no blacklist in Hollywood. I may be completely wrong about this. Oh, there's my agent calling right now, telling me I just didn't get the job I interviewed for at Warner Brothers this afternoon. They have spies everywhere, monsieur, spies. I don't believe there is a blacklist. I go back to storytelling. I think if you tell a good story, that's what those of us in this part of the creative business really are all about. Now that I've become a New York Post columnist, I lost even more friends from the old days back in New York. But I do think we have to stand up. We have to take it. And so if I take one for the team, if I'm the out conservative who finally gets blacklisted in Hollywood, then we'll know that there's a blacklist. But I don't believe that's true, and I had two very, very productive meetings today at one of the major studios, and I just think that it's not the case. Of course, David Kahane is a complete idiot, so he may be totally wrong about that. Yes?
Hi. Question, the left has gotten a lot of mileage since, 30, 40, 50 years about the original blacklist of the 40s
Yes.
and the 50s. How do you respond to that? Typically, that argument when they say, well, look what the right does when it's in charge, look at the excesses that they subject the rest of us to. We can't go there again.
Yeah, well, we got an extra hour we don't need, so let's talk about that. I think was it Reagan used to say it's not what they know to be true, it's what they think is true, so something like that. But a lot of my friends, my ex-friends, I should say, well, what about the McCarthy era and the blacklist? First of all, the McCarthy had nothing to do with the blacklist. Nothing. The blacklist was involved with the House Un-American Activities Committee, and it preceded, or did it antecede? I can't remember now. But it was separate and apart from McCarthy's, Army McCarthy hearings and his allegations, in some cases true, that there were communists in various parts of the United States government. The blacklist was done by the studio heads. It wasn't done by the government. The government had nothing to do with the blacklist. Now you could say, well, they were in fear of HUAC and a lot of other things, but the blacklist was Hollywood's own mechanism for keeping the heat off of Hollywood. And as I say, the greatest conservative movie was written by one of the blacklisted screenwriters. And many of the screenwriters then just continued to work, but they used other names. So I think a lot of it is overblown. But then again, I wasn't there. I'm not of that generation, so I don't know how bad the blacklist really was. But it has nothing to do with Joe McCarthy. It had nothing to do with the government, really.
How do you fight the media except by canceling subscriptions, changing channels or stations? This is where most of our information comes from. And it's hard to fight individuals or discuss with individuals who though the media is their only source of information, the major media.
Right. Well, as you know, Fox News is this giant media corporation that consumes everything in its path. And then there's only the little old New York Times, Washington Post, ABC, CBS, NBC, Time, Newsweek, etc., to stand up against this gargantuan juggernaut of hate. Fox News, I was on Hannity's show about a month and a half ago. That was a lot of fun. But, I mean, Fox News is only one channel, and yet that's the one they want to take away in the interests of diversity. You can't make this stuff up. Well, one of the things we tried to do, and you all know Andrew Breitbart, I'm sure. He's a local boy here from Brentwood. And Andrew came to me last year about this time and asked me to set up a new website called bigjournalism.com, which I hope some of you may have seen or will look at. And I did it, yes. And I did it for a year, and it was 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and trying to write 2 books in the website, I think, caused some of my cardio problems. But I was very proud of what we did with that site, because it was mostly pointing out media bias whenever we could. And offering you all another place to go for information. I do not recommend that you only listen to conservative talk radio, watch Fox News, and read the Washington Times. I mean, I don't recommend that. I read The Nation as often as I Sometimes I just burst into the old Soviet national anthem spontaneously. Da-dee-dum-ba-bee-bum. I love that too. I read The New Republic if you want to get a kind of center-left view. The internet makes all of this easily foundable, whatever. And so I would encourage all of us to do that. Again, it goes back to this notion of Milton's that that's how truth is found out. I mean, John Stuart Mill says something very similar. That you test these ideas, you test them in your own life. You know, we are all, I said on the National Review cruise to the conservatives, lead by example. You know, don't wait for us to do it. We're doing the best we can. But all of you in your lives, we have to lead moral, good lives according to our conscience and according to what we believe to be true. And we should illustrate that in how we behave to our fellow man. One of the most important rules I didn't mention here, because this is something that makes me really crazy, is I am sick and tired of being called a Nazi and being called a racist. And I've said to the left, if you call me a Nazi one more time, you better be prepared to settle this the Irish way.
The problems we have in California, the problems they had in Minnesota, all come from public unions, public employee unions. And he's sort of already, I think, proposing a wedge issue to deal with the Democrats, in that the public employee unions have gotten public employee salaries to $126,000 on the average, which is twice the amount of money that people in the private sector make when they're unionized. And I wonder whether you have any comments about that. He's talking about a national movement to do away with public sector unions.
Well, it's not a historically unprecedented idea because they're a relatively new concept. President Kennedy was the one that allowed federal workers to unionize in the 1960s. All you California taxpayers, the thing that's going to eat your lunch is CalPERS. And you know that. You're doomed. Run for your lives. SEIU, these are essentially criminal rackets. They negotiate with the politicians. They are paid through tax dollars, which then are refunneled back to those same politicians who are going to raise your taxes. If they were not unionized and they couldn't do this, that would really change the dynamics, which is why the Democrat Party will never, ever change that. They will go to the mat before any public employee unions are decertified. But the question is, can you afford to pay somebody to retire at 52 and live to be 90 and pay them, 90% of what they were getting, at their highest salary? I'm not sure of the details. But it's a tremendous issue. It's one that Schwarzenegger tried to take on and failed, and then essentially abdicated. So now it's up to Jerry Brown. God help us all.
The idea of eliminating the national debt by selling or leasing one of the 50 states.
Oh, well, let's not stop with one state. I can think of a whole bunch of them. Well, in answer to that, your first question about government being the problem, not the solution, I don't think I agree with the St. Reagan about that. I think government is what gave us the country we have. That is the framework of a governmental structure that is in the Constitution. Michael Medved and I were, Michael had me on his show about a month ago, and I was debating someone from Media Matters who was very incensed about the Tea Party, and all he could say was, yeah, but they're racist. And then I'd say, yeah, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, but they're racist. And there was like an hour of like being in a lunatic asylum. But Medved and I were talking off mic after the show was over, and he said, I don't agree with your subtitle here, Beating the Left at Its Own Game to Take Back America. He says, we're not really trying to take back America, we're trying to take back the American government. I don't know how you feel about that. And I thought about that, and I said, Michael, I really don't agree with you. I think we're talking about the soul of the country. The government is part of the expression of the soul of the country, but there was an America before there was a Constitution. There was an America before there was a presidential election. And I think that limited, effective government does not have to be ruinously expensive, which is what we have today. So that's what, again, by getting back to principles, I think we can solve a lot of our financial problems just by realizing that the old 10th Amendment actually means what it says, doesn't it? That all powers not specifically given to the government are reserved to you. I think they've taken a lot of your powers away from you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Michael. Books are going to be sold outside, and I think everybody should buy one for one of their leftist friends, since they're already not talking to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.